So time travel, and specifically alternate timelines. Like, what if you change just one thing in the past? How drastically different would things be in the present? Well, it's quite a popular idea, so much that there's a ton of media about it, from movies, books, and even whole YouTube channels built around it. And some of my favorites include games like the Command & Conquer Red Alert series, whose whole premise is, what if Einstein took a trip into the past and shook a very specific Austrian painter's hand so hard that he didn't exist to help cause World War II? Well, that just caused other problems with even more facial hair to take his place in world events, and for world domination shenanigans to ensue with crazy sci-fi super weapons that didn't quite get past the planning stage in our timeline. Now, instead of that scenario happening, let's say a game fiddled with the Cold War era, with Soviet scientists in the 1950s messing around with a new element called E99 that let them create time travel tech on a remote island. But maybe they skip a few safety standards and then maybe do some very questionable experiments with it, and eventually it causes a time Chernobyl event to happen which gets covered up and forgotten about, only for decades later to start acting up in 2010, which causes the US to want to take a peek over international borders, just with a few armed soldiers. I mean, borders are just a suggestion, right? Americans don't get caught up about stuff like that. But one of these soldiers named Renko gets accidentally sent back in time and saves someone they shouldn't have, which changes things so much in the past that the Soviet Union took over the world. And now you get to fix it with some handy time powers while maybe questioning Renko's sanity a bit. That's the general premise of Singularity, the last game made by Raven Software before selling the soul to Activision to survive, where they now get all the money and support they'll ever need, but have to keep making Call of Duty games forever. I imagine the meeting for that went something like this.
Welcome to hell, motherfucker!
Singularity was the tipping point that sent them down the Call of Duty timeline, since it didn't sell too well, which put them in a deal with the devil situation. It's pretty sad because the game had a lot of potential, but with a very rough development caused by scope creep and overestimating what PCs and consoles could do at the time, it eventually led to a rush to get the game out as quick as possible with whatever they could get working. That pretty much cut short any shot it had of reaching its full potential. Like, you know that story about how Half-Life was first developed and they had all those cool ideas but it wasn't coming together to make a good game? So they took those good ideas from their first attempt and restarted, but this time making sure it all worked together from the beginning. Raven was sort of in a similar situation with Singularity, but they didn't get to restart. They had to put it all together from what they had and speed run the rest of development. Like, this game has moments where you can see what they were going for by using the time powers for creative gameplay. For instance, there's this one section of the game where it's almost an immersive sim by accident, but more on that later. The game as it is still pretty fun to play, though it is very much a product of the time it was made, where you can clearly see the influences of certain games from the era, which actually, now that I'm thinking about it, makes it actually feel pretty unique compared to the current crop of big shooters who are all trying to be live services with so many IPs thrown in they kinda have no identity anymore. Or that next big trend which is supposed to be extraction shooters, which should kick in any day now. Like, did anyone else's excitement for the new Marathon game drop like a rock when it was shown to be an extraction shooter? Or was it just me? Anyway, back to the nostalgia. Singularity does suffer from 2010's brown game syndrome, but does have some nice touches of colour here and there. That does give a nice bit of contrast, especially when going from the broken, rusted present day to the past, where everything is new and clean, though because of the rushed development you might notice some assets being reused from the future, like lockers. But other than that, the game nails the setting it's going for, which is a dark, gritty, run-down modern day versus a bright, vibrant, propaganda-filled Soviet Union of the past. The modern day stuff also has the benefit of being a little spooky when it wants to be.
Hello there.
Though that quickly drops off as you get more into the action, but I did appreciate the supernatural vibes at the beginning. It was good for building a little anxiety when going further into the game. Also, all the small interactable stuff you find while looking around was a nice little distraction that kept tempting me to push any buttons I found. Sound-wise, it's also solid, nice eerie tracks when needed, and subtle action music for building a bit of tension in combat. It's not spectacular music or anything, but it gets the job done. Weapon sounds also good, though again nothing really stood out. And continuing this trend was the voice acting, which is alright, but probably has one of the most generic casts in video games, with Nolan North and Steve Bloom starring.
Name, rank, and serial number. That's all you get from us, Ivan. Check your Geneva Convention handbook.
I did away with that little inconvenience years ago.
Like, it's not their fault they were cast in so many video games, but once I started recognizing their voices popping up so much, I stopped thinking of them as the characters they're playing and just kept thinking, oh, that's Nolan North and Steve Bloom again. Like, if this game had the other guy who's been in too many video games, you know who I'm talking about, it would easily win the most generic voice cast of all time.
You can't keep getting away with.
So, time powers. The game is fairly good at giving them to you at a nice pace through the campaign, but it takes a little bit before you get any at the start, as after crashing on the island the game has you roam around a little before you get them, though that gives you the option to explore and find out more about the island's history if you want to, and enjoy some Soviet propaganda that has a very 1950s Fallout vibe to it. I like the slow start the game has, as it builds some tension as you explore and lets you see how horrible things got, and that you might not be equipped to handle what's coming.
It's mutating humans into violent monsters, and they feed on human flesh.
But the game doesn't entirely nail it. Like, the starting weapon is an underpowered revolver which is only effective if you get a headshot with it. I think it was made this way to help keep the tension going when you first encounter enemies and still teach you that you can shoot some locks in the game, but it didn't really end up having the intended effect. As from what I've seen online, most people using it get annoyed with it as a starting weapon and then quickly forget about it once they get a hold of the assault rifle. Like, I get what the game is going for by having you feel underpowered at the start to make you feel more powerful later, though doing it with an underpowered gun was maybe not the best idea. As most people when they get a gun in a game after not having one for a bit will feel that, oh, I can actually fight back now. But then when it turns out the gun is near useless, there's gonna be a bit of a disconnect, especially with the gun being a revolver, which most games tend to show as being a powerful handgun. That's not the best start for a game where shooting is going to form a lot of the gameplay. And if the game was trying to make you feel underpowered at the start, maybe it should have borrowed some more ideas from Half-Life. Like starting off with a more useful melee weapon instead of a gun that you could use to show players they can break stuff. Or maybe just have you sneak around enemies at the start without a weapon, because when they try to do it later in the game when you actually have one, it doesn't work so well. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm not saying the start is terrible, just that it's lacking a little polish, which was probably because it was thrown together in such a rush. The game does pick up once you get other weapons, which mostly all feel good to use. It's the usual suspects of an accurate enough assault rifle, a shotgun with a little kick to it, and a sniper rifle, which does come with a nice slowdown time option and feels great to get headshots with. All of them are fairly fun to use and get the job done. They can also be upgraded at these weapon stations around the levels with these weapon tech cases that you'll find as you go throughout the game. Some are easy to find while others you'll have to look around for. Though don't waste the upgrades on some of the other weapons you can find, like the exploding ball launcher one, which is only really useful for a very specific section. Or the spike gun that takes too long to charge to be effective. It does have a cool thermal sight on it, which made me initially think maybe it was going to be a weapon that could shoot through walls or something, but no, it just shoots explosives, painfully slow. These two weapons feel the most like they were leftovers from the rough development. But to make up for those letdowns, the game does give two very awesome weapons, one being an autocannon that once you get will probably take a permanent position in one of your two weapon slots. It shreds through mostly everything and makes you feel nearly unstoppable, and has almost no downsides to using it. So once you get it, you're probably not going to use anything else, which is probably a result of the rushed dev time, but I'm not going to complain about it, this gun is great. The other weapon though is by far the best one in the game, the Seeker, a prototype E99 weapon that lets you guide shots at bullet time speeds with devastating results. It has a very cool design too, with sights that give a very sciencey prototype feel, which for some reason I just really liked.
Yes, science!
It's really satisfying getting a hit with it over and over again, which is probably why you only get it at certain sections of the game, because if you had it the whole game you'd probably overuse it to death. It would be very fun though. So while the game does have a few misses with its lineup of weapons, which makes the shallow pool of guns even smaller, most are good with some really great ones. The enemies you'll be using these weapons on are going to come in basically two variants, lots of expendable Soviet soldiers and horribly disfigured mutant zombie things. Each group has their own variants, beefy ones, slender ones, you know, your standard setup. None were too memorable except maybe the blue time mutants that are pretty acrobatic and have a cool phase out time ability that's good at making you waste shots and forcing you to think a little in combat. They also for some reason kept reminding me of specific alien creatures from a certain music video that if I say the name of might get stuck in your head. Not today, pal. There's also a version of this enemy that you'll face once or twice that's really fast, so you'll have to figure out how to slow it down to get a shot in. They are sort of a mini-boss, but the fights are so quick that I think most people forget about them. It would have been nice to see them mixed in with other enemies, but just to keep you on your toes. There are a few proper boss enemies, though the game maybe focuses a little too much on giving them weak spots you could see from space. They were a little creative with this one, who has a serious worm problem. It's an okay fight, though it does feel a bit like a tutorial on how to catch barrels with the gravity manipulation ability. Speaking of which, the main selling point of this game is the powers you get from the TMD, a gauntlet that lets you do some fun time stuff, like aging or renewing specific objects or throwing out a bubble which stops time in it for everything except you. Very fun for killing groups of enemies at your leisure, and for environmental puzzles, which Raven seemed to be a big fan of in this game, though most of the puzzles will have you use the gravity hand powers that do feel a little non-related to the whole time power setup. But it's a good mechanic, and if you are going to borrow from Half-Life, then you might as well use the good stuff, I guess. Like, apart from using it in puzzles, it's pretty fun to use in combat, from throwing barrels to yanking annoying enemies' shields away from them. Though it is more fun to use your time powers on enemies to turn them into instant mummies, or turning Soviet soldiers into mutants that will fight anyone near them. There's also a time force push ability that's good for keeping enemies at a distance and also knocking those blue mutants out of their time shift shenanigans. Considering how rushed together this game was, it's pretty amazing how all these powers are so fun to use in combat, and that most enemy encounters are generally well balanced and not a buggy mess. Well, there is one literal buggy mess of a fight in this game, which I think is the most memorable one, and nearly everyone hates it, including me. The infamous tick fight in the sewers. It has these little shits coming at you like banelings hopped up on too much OJ. In theory, you have a lot of tools to deal with them. You can use a shotgun or force ability to kill a lot of them coming at you, or use a time bubble to stop them in place, and even use the TMD to age one of them into a fat tick that will distract them. Or even use a combination of those, but in practice it's never quite enough. A few always get through, and it only takes a few to kill you. They do appear in other parts of the game to be annoying, but never as bad as this section, where there are just too many to reasonably deal with. I think the problem is that while you do have the tools, they all have weaknesses that overlap with each other. Like the shotgun takes too long to reload and you run out of TMD energy too quickly to keep using the time powers, and the time bubble, which doesn't use energy, takes a little too long to charge up to use in the middle of being chased down. So you kinda have to brute force your way through many deaths and get a little lucky to get past them. Again, that rushed dev time is showing up, and it's not the only part where the cracks are showing, as the game does have, let's say, a first draft of a stealth section. Which I'll give credit to the game. When you first get into it, you'll probably follow the very strong hints the game gives you to rather sneak around these blind enemies than to actually fight them. But the illusion quickly falls apart if you shoot any of the enemies, as they go down way too easy to justify sneaking around them. I mean, you can pretend they're scary, but you'll probably feel a little silly doing that. Now you might be thinking, well, why didn't the devs just make these specific enemies harder to kill? Like, they don't appear that often in the game, so buff up their health and problem solved, right? Well, there would be an issue, as these enemies called reverts are the same ones you can change enemy soldiers into with your TMD powers. And as they are, they already take out a few enemy soldiers by themselves, so if you increase their health, they'd probably be way overpowered. So how do you balance that on a tight deadline where you can't really make any major changes to the game without it taking too long? Well, you can't really, you'd have to compromise somewhere, and the sneaking section is it. Though this is just speculation on my part, it's just my best guess. Maybe there were other reasons. But but for all the game's shortcomings, it does have some fun and interesting mechanics to play around with, that I think if the devs had more time with, they could have come up with some really cool stuff. Like the systems in the game as they are already let you do a little unintentional immersive sim stuff. For example, in this one later part of the game, you get to this locked door that you can then open from the other side to make progress. Now the way you're meant to get past it is to do this physics puzzle with your time powers, which will get you high enough to get access to a vent you can crawl in, then drop into the room with the locked door and shoot the lock, which will open it. But if you happen to still have the Seeker rifle on you, you could instead use its bullet time shot and guide it into and out of the vent and shoot the lock on the other side of the door, which is a totally viable solution. Like I don't think it was designed to work like that on purpose, more like a happy coincidence. Though it is still pretty neat seeing a game being an accidental immersive sim. Even though it's just this one part, you can see the potential of what this game could have been. This also shows up with the story. It's got some interesting narrative things going on, but it's kind of all over the place. Like if you look for it, there was some effort put into the world building, even on the small stuff. For instance, there are these wall mine plant things you come across in the game that seem a little random, but later on you can find out they were part of an E99 crop experiment to create a form of explosive pest control. And yeah, that sounds on track for the level of bad decisions with science going on here. Most of which you can find in notes or audio recordings, like the stuff they were doing to kids going to school on the island, by adding little bits of E99 to their food.
I don't understand why I can't be with my friends during lunch. They make us all sit at assigned tables and force us to eat the food they put in front of us. We can't trade with anyone. Not that I feel like eating much. My stomach has been hurting a lot lately.
Yeah, yikes. It's setting the tone fairly well for what was happening here, and why this place is such a disaster. The game, however, does overuse audio recordings a little too much for its world building. Like, was everyone on this island just carrying around these pretty bulky tape recorders? Though maybe I'm being a little nitpicky on that one. The main story itself feels simple enough to follow if you don't think about it too much and just go along for the ride. Renko accidentally went to the past, then saved a guy named Demichev who was supposed to die, and Demichev ended up taking over the Soviet Union in the past and then the whole world using E99. Now Renko's got to try and go back in time with the help of another guy named Barisov who also worked on the island to fix the problem he created, and shenanigans ensue. It does however get a little more complicated once you look at it more closely though, with time paradoxes between what you're doing in the past not affecting the future being hand-waved away just to keep the story going, and it being implied on notes on the wall that Renko has been going through so many timelines to the point that he might be going a little insane and not knowing who to trust anymore. Also, like, this British lady will just show up in the story to show you this cool video she found online.
We are Mere 12.
That introduces what you think is going to be an important faction called Mere 12 who know about the timeline changes because of a journal that has details about what happened on the island. And they pretty much don't do anything, like it's more of a reason to justify why this random lady is suddenly helping you, and I think to show there's a resistance against the Soviet Union's world domination. Then later on in the story, Barisov will mention, oh yeah, she died off screen while you were doing stuff, so don't worry about her anymore.
What?
Like, this is one of those stories where you can almost feel the writers struggling to make all these story elements be cohesive and sort of make sense, but kind of just giving up eventually. Those notes on the wall aren't just Renko going insane trying to make sense of what's happening. But for all that stuff, the story does build up to an interesting premise of who should Renko trust after going through all this time nonsense, which means going into spoilers about multiple endings, so if you don't want those, then skip to here. So the game has 3 endings which you get to pick by choosing who to shoot in the final confrontation between you, Barisov and Demichev. They give compelling reasons, like Barisov, who has been trying to fix a timeline with you, has been coming up with solutions the whole game, but none have really worked. And that includes some really drastic stuff like going back in time and blowing up the E99 reactor, which just gets rebuilt by Demichev. So the simplest solution, which everyone is probably yelling at the screen at this point, is just go back in time and get Renko to tell himself not to save Demichev. But apparently you've tried that before and that didn't work.
Renko, stop! Don't let Demichev!
And for some reason going back to the past and shooting Demichev doesn't work either. So the only solution Barisov can come up with now is that since you caused the messed up timeline, you need to forcefully stop yourself from saving Demichev, which means...
kill himself? You're asking a man to sacrifice himself for something you've been mistaken about. How many times now? I'm not sure you reliable authority, Beresov.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a great option, and seeing an opportunity, Demichev, who remember controls most of the world, offers to share power with you if instead of killing yourself, you kill Beresov. Which you can do, and results in an ending where Renko becomes the commander of Demi's forces, and even trains mutants from the island to fight for him, and eventually crush all resistance. But with no enemies left, you and Demichev start eyeing each other up, with the world split on who to follow. And that leads to a new Cold War situation. Or if you don't want to side with either Demichev or Beresov, you can just shoot them both, and that leads to Renko going into hiding and the Soviet Union just utterly falling apart. And a minor explosion involving the E-99 reactor that destroys the coasts of 2 continents, with some mutants now hanging out in Asia. And then Renko later building up an army with his TMD powers to take over what's left of the US. But the last ending you can choose, which is the one the game devs were most likely going to make a sequel for if this game sold better, was the one where you do the self-sacrifice thing and go back in time and shoot yourself. Which you'd think would time paradox you out of existence, but apparently wires get crossed or something and you end up back at the beginning. Which is actually a fun fake out, as the timeline is still not fixed.
Ha! What'd I tell you? There's never anything interesting here. Right, comrade?
Somehow Beresov is now in charge of the Soviet Union, and Renko is apparently part of the Red Army while still being aware of everything that's happened. What I like about all these endings is that they all make an intriguing start for a sequel, where there's either a time Cold War happening between superpowers, or the remnants of the United States are now trying to take over the world thanks to Renko being the only one with time powers, or now Beresov is in charge of the world and the only ones aware of the time shenanigans is Renko and maybe Mir 12. With how the story is set up, they could even do something crazy and have all 3 endings be valid, Deus Ex Invisible War style, and have Renko hopping between them trying to figure out this mess. Another interesting thing is that every ending has a post-credit cutscene where that British lady didn't actually die, but instead got sent back to the past and made the journal that led to Mir 12 becoming a thing. So maybe she's the last thread that's keeping the timeline from going back to how it was. Meaning that all the things Renko is doing to fix the timeline was never going to work, because this journal existing with future knowledge in the past was always going to change it. So unlike most time travel stories where you can go back and fix stuff to be mostly how they were, that doesn't seem to be an option here. Which I think is really cool, since a lot of stories like this just reset things back to how they were, and that's a bit of a boring way to end a story. Like, this way of ending the game has great potential. Even with the game's story being all over the place, they still managed to make a bunch of compelling endings that I would have liked to have seen what they could have done with, but we don't live in that timeline, which is a little sad. So overall the gameplay experience is good and has some unique mechanics. It does feel a bit derivative at times though, but like some of the stuff this game is doing isn't really done that much anymore in our current hellscape of AAA shooters. I mean, at least we have some indie shooters picking up some of the slack. Though seeing how much potential this game had does make me wish for a timeline where this game was more of a success. I know I'm not the only one who would like to see this game get a remake or remaster of some kind, where Raven could push the mechanics and gameplay as far as they want, though with some hindsight on how the original turned out, and polish it up a bit so the bugs in this game are less of a menace. Oh, and maybe some minor tweaks to the story just to get rid of 1 or 2 of those time paradoxes. Though I don't think Raven is ever getting out of that contract with the devil, even though they sort of have a new overlord, it's all wishful thinking at this point. But we can still play this game at least, which I recommend giving a go, just to experience that last bit of creative freedom Raven had. So thanks for checking out the video. If you got this far and enjoyed it, maybe throw a like or sub my way. Anyway, see you next time.